Good afternoon to everybody who's in attendance. This is a platform convened by the Climate Justice Charter Movement and allies. Our panel topic for today is rolling blackouts in the Eskom crisis, what alternatives for the deep, just transition. Now we know that things are burning. We know the planet is burning from climate change. We know that Eskom is a coal-heavy energy supplier, 90% of it coming from coal. We also know the country is burning in other ways. So we're having this panel in this difficult context of converging crises. Eskom is a large parastatal, as you all know, responsible for supplying our homes and workplaces with electricity. And we've seen consistent crisis in that context. We've seen the denuding of planning capacity. We've seen major sort of technical failure. We've seen a ballooning debt, which threatens the entire fiscus. And at the same time, we are also sitting in a climate crisis, a worsening climate crisis. The Climate Justice Charter movement that we shared with Parliament last year calls for socially and community-owned renewable energy and alternatives. And it's in that context that we've decided to pull together some of the leading thinkers in the country that have been grappling with the issue of alternatives to Eskom. Now, as things unfold pretty fast, the debate has to also catch up. You know, you suddenly have a realizing that despite its commitment to coal, it needs to keep an economy going and therefore making certain concessions. But where does this leave us? So help us grapple with this. We have a panel of 4 speakers. Unfortunately, Matthew Grant from the South African Federation of Trade Unions that holds a position on socially owned renewable energy couldn't be here today. His house was robbed actually last night, so he lost his computer. But we have other speakers. We have Bruce Baigrie, is a political organizer and researcher as the Alternative Information and Development Center. He focuses on energy, ecology, climate as part of alternatives to extractivism, as part of the climate change program, and much of his work is guided by the AIDC's Eskom transformed research. He has a master's in conservation biology and is an admitted PhD student in geography at Sydney University. Accompanying him on the panel today would be Janet Cherry. She's a South African socialist activist and academic. She is currently professor of development studies at Nelson Mandela University in Port Elizabeth. She has a PhD in sociology from Rhodes University. Her main areas of research are sustainable development, political economy of development, democratic participation, and social and political history. She has published 2 books, as well as a number of articles and chapters in books on South African issues, labor, women's and social movements, transitional justice, and sustainable development. We also have on the platform today Mark Swilling, a distinguished professor of sustainable development at the University of Stellenbosch and co-director of the Center for Sustainability Transitions. His latest book is on the age of sustainability, just transitions in a complex world. He is also co-authored with Ave Annika, Just Transitions, Explorations of Sustainability in an Unfair World. He's a member of UNEP's International Resource Panel, acting as coordinator of the Cities Working Group, and is the deputy chair of the board of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. He is co-lead author of The Weight of Cities, Resource Requirements of Future Urbanization, published in 2018 by the International Resource Panel. He has been a visiting professor at the universities of Sheffield and Utrecht, and in 2018 was the Edward P. Bass Visiting Environmental Scholar at Yale University. Thank you to all of you for making your time and being available for this panel. I'll give each of you 15 minutes to give us your perspective on the topic. We'll start with Bruce. Over to you, Bruce. Do you need to share screen, Bruce?
I do.
Okay. Jane, is that allowed?
Very good. Oh. Just making sure. Okay, can everyone see?
Yes, we can.
Is that good? All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be on such a great panel. And as Fish said, I'm from the AIDC, but I'd also like to kind of plug the Eskom Research Reference Group. And that is a group that includes researchers from the AIDC, but also trade unions for energy democracy and the Transnational Institute, who really were critical in much of the research that my presentation will draw on. So the title for this event talks about the blackouts. And there's a lot to say, but I think I'm going to limit myself to just stating that we need capacity and we need it fast. And in a bit of shameless self-promotion, I wrote an article recently in the Daily Maverick where I conceded this, but pointed out that the precedent that it sets and the potential private generation that can come out of this decision is monumental. The estimates range from 5,000 to 15,000 megawatts of capacity that the private sector would produce. To put that in context, Kusile and Medupe are both below 5,000, and 15,000 would be about a third of Eskom's current capacity. And I think it's important to note that business was asking for 50 and they got 100. But I want to focus on the just transition, the deep just transition element of it, and maybe to start with what is our current transition, what's going on at the moment. And we overwhelmingly have private renewables for profit. Eskom does have some renewable energy. We have incoming gas IPPs, and I think once again we should really thank civil society, the environmental left, for delivering us from another awful energy deal in the form of the car power ships. But it seems that a new gas is going to be a big feature in the future. And then in terms of socially owned renewables, Eskom is not really making big moves in that direction. It's quite clear that the main priority of the government and the executive is to drive forward with the unbundling process to kind of create or deepen the market aspect of generation. You need to separate out Eskom transmission so it can be a fair player for private investors to keep coming in and building generation. In terms of what Eskom's got planned for its own renewable energy, this was a graph from a presentation by the Just Transition Office. They spoke about 7,000 megawatts of renewable energy up until 2025. Although, as you can see, 4,000 megawatts is gas. So it's not particularly ambitious at all. And one of the key themes I want to draw out today is that private renewables will not save us. And when I say won't save us, I'm of course referring to meeting climate targets, preferably, well, not preferably, but we have to meet targets that will keep us within a 1.5 degree increase. And if we look at global new investment in renewable energy capacity, there was undoubtedly an incredible boom in investment, exponential increases for the most part. But the previous decade has been very different. There have been drops in gross investment in certain years. The rate has dramatically slowed. And the primary reason for this is that a lot of countries that had put in a lot of support for the private sector, feed-in tariffs in particular, started to remove those subsidies. So without that kind of support from the state, private investors were not as keen to invest in the same rates as they were doing so. I should qualify that last year saw almost an unprecedented amount of renewable energy capacity added in China. But again, this comes back to the subsidies question. China have now, or are now officially removing such support from their renewable energy industry. And so a whole lot of generators wanted to get their projects in and built before the end of this period so that they could max out on those support systems. But for the next 5 years at least, they will not be available, and you can probably see a similar pattern. Now, renewable energy has gotten dramatically cheaper to build, so it's fair to say that you get a lot more capacity for the amount that you invest in. But we can even go to the International Renewable Energy Agency, and their conservative annual investment targets. So this is also for 2 degrees, not 1.5 degrees. They say we need to have double the current investment. So kind of 134% increase from a kind of 5 increase that we had in 2019. And I'm firmly of the belief that we will go the same way. And we can go back to the Eskom CEO, where he says, I anticipate there will be far less availability of sovereign guarantees to support private investors. The model whereby IPPs were offered 20-year investment guarantees was a lovely business that could not be sustained into the future. The private investor will have to take more business risk. And I think, as we all know, these private investors in renewable energy are not investing in renewable energy to save the planet. They're doing it because it helps their bottom line. And risk doesn't help that, especially when your product is selling energy to an incredibly poor country like South Africa. So the less risk that the state takes on, the less private renewable investment we're going to get. And I think it's important to keep kind of contextualizing where we're at in the global transition. If you look at the dark orange line, that's renewable energy. And of course, that's a very clear upward trend. But we're talking about 12% of global electricity generation. If we then go over to energy, it's even lower. It's much lower. And of course, the power sector is the easiest thing to decarbonize. It's the thing we have to decarbonize fastest. So we are very, very far away from where we need to be. And of course, the upshot of that is that emissions have barely dropped and are still unacceptably high. And so I would maintain that the market is failing and will fail us. There's a great report by UNCTAD kind of pointing out the failures of public-private partnerships. I mean, this is research commissioned by the European Union itself, and that it's just not sourcing the investment that is required. And so you have publications like the Financial Times saying, you know, the state is going to have to get more involved. There's going to need to be more planning. And you know, today it comes back to risk. There has to be investment that will take risks because the transition is actually going to be expensive and in many ways unprofitable in the short run. And this is referred to as facing up to the tragedy of the horizon. So realigning narrow and short-term focus on profitability with the long-term challenges of climate change. But don't expect this to just happen. Don't expect neoliberalism to recede. As per the climate envoy for the United States, John Kerry, markets, not the government, will solve climate change. And I've been increasingly hearing that their investment infrastructure deals are increasingly going down in the amount they want to invest, and are also being opened up to the private sector. And I'd like us to also take a step back with respect to the transition, because it's, of course, about the climate, about workers and communities, but it's, of course, also about producing the energy that we need. But the key question is producing it to what end? Are we producing energy for profit within the same kind of economic paradigm that we've been in? Or can we look beyond that to what I would say is producing energy as a public good? And if it is for a public good, which I suspect most of us would agree with, then we firmly maintain that the alternative is right in front of us, and it remains Eskom, but it of course has to be a completely different Eskom, an Eskom transform, as we call it. And why does it have to be Eskom? Well, with respect to the just part of the transition, it has the existing, well, much of the existing workforce that is going to be most deeply implicated. It has the existing infrastructure that is going to be the backbone of a transition. It is the most appropriate vehicle for the necessary and unprecedented levels of investment that we need. There's a star in front of that because, of course, in its current state, it can barely raise any capital, and it is publicly owned. And I put that in quotation marks because I think Eskom is anything but a true public utility that we want, but it is a lot closer to that than any kind of IPP can and ever will be. I also want to caution against the kind of hype around small. That small is not necessarily good and big not necessarily bad. I would say beware of the hype of community-owned energy. I think the appeal is completely understandable, considering there are communities with no access to electricity, the promise of being able to produce something to help finance your livelihoods. But this amorphous concept of community can be molded to privilege private interests, or kind of that leadership class of community representatives. And most importantly, communities producing energy for profit and in competition with each other is no solution. That's not producing energy for a public good, and you're still selling your energy to working class people who can't own their own community energy. A renewable energy system is unprecedentedly complex, and that's, we have to electrify everything. This is not an argument against renewable energy. It's just, it needs to be recognized that as systems have increasing renewable energy, it gets incredibly complex. There are challenges and obstacles that we need to take head on. But having that in one system where generation is linked with transition in one entity seems a lot better to me. And from the perspective of the left, this transition is going to be economy-wide. Capital has big power, and we need our own big power. And I think it's hard to maybe see Eskom as that right now, but a publicly controlled Eskom in a more socio-democratic state, I think, can be exactly that. So yeah, Eskom, I must be crazy, and I think fair enough to an extent. But I think we need to first recognize that Eskom is not a kind of public utility as we might want to be. It operates as a corporation. It has a mandate for full cost recovery, and has many of the practices that we would want to see disappear. And this has implications for its finances as well. On the issue of corruption, there's no doubt that this is a huge problem and accounts for a large part of its financial crisis. And we need a kind of different kind of accountability that I hope could come through more worker participation and control in decisions at Eskom. But I would also want to say that I don't think we should just accept that this is something endemic to Eskom, that Eskom can't turn this around. And I think to his credit, De Ruyter has seemingly taken some great steps towards recovering stolen funds, renegotiating dodgy contracts, getting rid of other ones. And I was certainly impressed when Judge Dennis Davis asked him, can Eskom be saved? What about the rampant looting? And he pointed out that the overwhelming majority of Eskom employees are committed to the utility, to delivering energy, and are not implicated in this. So I would say we can turn it around, and as much public and social pressure that supports these actions, that's very important. I think I've gone over time, but this is a graphic which, just to touch on, there are ways in which one can produce electricity as a public good, so that every person has a certain amount of energy that meets their needs, that we can use, that we can produce cheap energy for the kind of industrialization that we want, and punish companies that don't decarbonize, and that the costs of this can be shouldered on the wider economy, on the wealthy in the economy. And it's not expected that Eskom needs to cover all these costs, because Eskom's mandate is to deliver energy for a public good. And just to finish off, I think urgent tasks for the left with this respect, we have to, of course, keep up the fight against fossil capital and those who are kind of promoting its interests. I think with the current crisis, it's never been more pressing that the anti-austerity campaigns be intensified, that we deliver a basic income grant to relieve the social crises. But of course, I don't see how you're going to finance a just transition under austerity. And we need to get back, and when I say we, I'm talking about the environmental left. Environmentalists need to get back to Labour. We need to re-engage Labour, particularly NUM and NUMSA, on their role in leading this process. And I believe that this is completely possible. I've been with NUM shop stewards in Mpumalanga, and they are just worried about having to work in the private sector, but are completely open to the idea of renewable energy given the urgency of the climate crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for that input. Lots of thought-provoking stuff. We're going to hand over to Janet. Janet, over to you. Do you need to screen share? Or... Janet, are you there? Janet.
Sorry, I'm here, Vish. I'm just wanting to screen share, and I'm swapping between my screen and your screen. Can I screen share myself? I can't see how I can do it. Oh, here we go. Okay, let me try.
It's coming up. Yeah, it's here.
Okay, can you see, guys?
Yeah, we got it. Thank you.
All right, so I'm just going to give a very brief input on this issue, and I'm going to go a little bit to the other extreme in terms of not small, but what we focus on, which is decentralizing energy away from Eskom. And I think the sort of principles of what we are piloting in Nelson Mandela Bay are decentralization and localization. And what's been referred to by the previous speaker as socially owned or community owned renewable energy models. And you know, we really are in a quite a delicate process of trying to make this work in a public-private partnership, which is in the form of a neighborhood cooperative in a township with the Nelson Mandela Bay municipality. So we can't say for sure that this will work, but it's generated quite a lot of excitement in Nelson Mandela Bay, in KwaZulu-Natal. And we're trying to see whether this can possibly be an alternative. So there are all kinds of problems with it. If we look at let's look firstly at the excitement. So if you can you see this slide now? This is the Saltuba Cooperative. It's a very small PV solar array in the middle of KwaZulu-Natal in a gap tap, which is a public open space. And basically the residents of that area control that public open space. And municipality has given permission for them to set up a cooperative, and we obviously got funding to establish the solar array. And it is connected to the grid, to the municipal grid. So what are the problems? Well, the problem is that it's been up for 18 months now, but the residents are not yet getting an income from it, because although they are feeding electricity into the grid, so the municipality is benefiting, the municipality hasn't yet implemented a mechanism whereby people can actually get paid for selling energy to them. So they promised us, and I'll show you the next slide. This was last year, I think September last year, and they promised us that they would be able to pay us from July this year. And it looks like, I mean, I just got a message from our renewable energy guy yesterday. It looks like that they are actually putting this mechanism into process. So it's actually an institutional problem. I mean, now that the legislation has been changed to allow for municipalities to buy or procure energy from private providers. So we want to basically pilot taking advantage of that and seeing how it can be done so that it actually doesn't benefit the big renewable energy companies, and to try and overcome one of the problems that Bruce was raising, which is that, you know, the big renewable energy companies and energy companies in general, I mean, they are in it for profit, you know, they're private companies, and they won't invest, they won't take a risk unless they can be sure that they're going to get a profit or return on their investment. So what we're looking at is how this can be done at local level, i.e. with local government being partners in this. And we're hoping to get support through, well, you know, through who supports local government, National Treasury, the city support program and so on, who are interested in providing support to local government. So what we're testing is whether this can be a win-win situation. I mean, it sounds a bit trite, but the idea is that residents of townships, rather than being the consumers of free electricity, are actually producers of energy and are able to earn income from that. We understand, of course, and I think Bruce pointed this out, that most working class people don't have capital, so they can't invest in solar arrays and so on. So we would obviously look for partnerships in terms of enabling the establishment of these. But once the solar arrays are in place, and it can take a number of different forms, then that neighborhood cooperative owns that asset. So they then start, after a few years, they start reaping the rewards of that. And I see my colleague Patrick Brennan is on this call, so he can answer questions about if people have it, about the economic model and how much can be generated. But this is a very small array, and at the moment it's generating about 1,000 rands worth of electricity a month. This just gives you a little idea. And then I'll show you the next slide, which is very optimistic. Of course, we have Guy Rogers in Nelson Mandela Bay, who's a very our environmental journalist who's very enthusiastic about this project. So he gives us lots of very good publicity, but you can see here his article saying it can be transformed. South Africa's energy landscape can be transformed by people power, and it can be a blueprint for countrywide rollout and so on. So we're very optimistic about this. Are there problems? There are big problems. One of the problems is the capacity of the municipality. And you know, of course, municipalities in the Eastern Cape are in a very poor state and don't have much capacity at all. There's also all kinds of problems with corruption and patronage at local level, ward committees and so on. So yeah, so part of the challenge to this model is, if it's done in partnership with local municipalities, whether they have the capacity to do it. And also, secondly, of course, that they have to put into place the institutional mechanisms for doing this, and for making sure that the communities who are contributing or producing the energy are actually paid for it, and that there's a mechanism for them to benefit in real economic terms from it. So that's our priority, is to test this and make sure that it can work in that respect. So it must be absolutely clear, we're not looking here at a self-sufficiency model, you know, of putting up RDP houses which each have their own PV panel so that they can produce their own electricity. We're looking at arrays which are big enough through the fact that they are community owned, that a number of households are involved, or institutions. I mean, we can also do this on other buildings, schools, businesses, etc. But they are big enough to produce electricity which can be sold. So that's the one challenge, is the municipality having the right institutional mechanisms and having the capacity to assist us in this. The other challenge is an organizational one. Obviously, that people have to be organized at community level in order to do this, and have to be capacitated to manage the facility. We don't think this is an insurmountable problem at all. And why we're doing it in KwaZulu is because this township has a very strong history of local organization, neighborhood committees and street committees and so on. So we think if it can work anywhere, you know, it'll work if it works in KwaZulu, it can work in other places, but it's a good place to start. Yeah, so there's another question which I wanted to raise in this regard, and it relates to what Bruce was saying, which I think is quite interesting. And that is this enough? Does this model, can it potentially produce enough electricity to meet our needs? So we've done some calculations. We think that PV solar can actually produce the energy needs for South Africa, but it does depend on how it is constructed and in in how it's linked into the grid, and in terms of people's needs and the needs of industry and so on. But I'm not sure that this locally produced model is going to meet the needs of big industry and so on. So yeah, we're saying that this is a potential solution for particular localized local municipalities and for household electricity. And then depending on what kind of surplus is produced, it can also sell that to local industry So it's a decentralized and localized grid, essentially. I wanted to also just raise a couple of other related issues in terms of other forms of energy. The one is the car power ship issue, which Bruce said we've dodged the bullet there, but actually I see that they are trying to renegotiate that contract and go back to another plan for the car power ship. And there is can we stop sharing for the moment? So yeah, so that I can talk to people. So the car power ship issue, it's been of some concern in Nelson Mandela Bay, and I'm quite interested in their argument that they want to reinstate this car power ship idea on the basis that it will create employment and that they will have certain offsets in terms of bringing in local black business to benefit from it. It really makes me worried, because it's exactly what was said about the arms deal, you know, like offsets promise that they will provide local employment and so on. And that seriously didn't happen in the case of Kucha, which was meant to be one of the beneficiaries of the arms offsets. So we're quite suspicious about the idea that the car power ship will result in any kind of local benefit. But I'd be interested in what other people think about that. The other thing that I'm interested in is the green hydrogen model, and whether, as the Minister of Trade and Industry, Ibrahim Patel, was saying, that green hydrogen in South Africa is a real potential game changer in terms of renewable energy, especially for transport, which is for trains and buses and trucks and so on. And that we have the platinum group metals, which are necessary for the electrolysis process to produce green hydrogen. I'm just throwing this out because I think it is potentially part of the solution in some kind of new reconstructed energy mix, where I would see like localized renewable energy from PV solar combined with possibly large state investment in green hydrogen for transport systems. And the last thing is nuclear, and and I see they've revived the plan to build another nuclear power station in our Eastern Cape coast at Oyster Bay. And I'm also interested in whether that is a possible solution and how people on this forum understand that in terms of the new energy mix. So I'm saying in response to Bruce's argument that we're not looking at small is good or at self-sufficiency being a potential answer to the energy crisis, but that some combination of decentralized PV solar, which can actually have economic benefits for the owners, who can be working class owners of that facility, combining that with more centralized energy supplies, which could be nuclear or green hydrogen. And both of them require quite a lot of state intervention and state investment at national or at local government level. Yeah, so that's my input into this debate at this point.
Great, thank you so much, Janet. Very inspiring, and the practice is prompting all kinds of interesting questions. Okay, over to Mark. Mark, do you need to screen share? So on.
No, I don't.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Vish, and thanks for this invitation. It's great to be on a panel with Janet, who we worked together many years ago. So yeah, I'm going to be maybe talking at macro perspective, with an institutional focus on Eskom. So just to capture just a couple of the key indicators of the crisis. So the Eskom debt is currently at about 400 billion. It was 480, it's come down. A lot of that related to the inefficiencies and corruption of building Medupi and Kusile. Obviously, state capture has taken its toll. It's a kind of quite a toxic institutional environment, which, as Bruce said, De Ruyter is trying to turn around. There are several old power stations that need to be closed as soon as possible. They cost more to run than building new renewables. There's quite a wide consensus that unless we get an additional 25 gigawatts of capacity onto the grid, we're looking at permanent load shedding by 2025. In terms of carbon emissions, business as usual, allow the RP means we're going to generate about 5 gigatons by 2050. A slightly more ambitious version without coal, IRP without coal would be 4 gigatons. An ambitious renewable ramp up of around 5 gigawatts per annum for basically forever, because once you start building renewables, you can't stop. You have to rebuild in 20 years' time what you build this year. So if we get into a ramp up to 5 gigawatts per annum, and we do that for up until 2050, we could save 2.5 gigatons. Sorry, 1.5 gigatons. We could bring it down from 4 to 2.5, and that puts us into reasonable target range. But for that ambitious ramp up, there's going to have to be a new kind of finance. So at the moment, you have disinvestment from fossil fuels on a massive scale by the biggest investors in the world, including the formation of a net zero association by the biggest asset managers with $36 trillion under management on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have massive investment in renewables, now over the 300 billion rand per annum mark. But if you include heat pumps and all the other things, it's about 500 billion, which is double. The 300 billion is double total investments in fossil fuels and nuclear combined. So what's missing in these two classes of capital is the kind of capital that's needed to support an incumbent like Eskom that wants to pivot from being a fossil fuel-based energy company to a renewables-based energy company. It needs capital. It has no access to the capital markets. It has no access to most of the financial institutions in the world now who have got board decisions not to support companies that have got who generate energy from coal. So what does Eskom do in that crisis? The sovereign is pretty much bankrupt, and so and you can't and Eskom, in terms of the way it currently operates, even if it won all its court cases and increased tariffs to a cost reflective level, it still wouldn't be able to service its debt. Can service at best 250 billion rands worth of debt. So that's the context of the crisis. I mean, globally, as I've already mentioned, there's some positive headwinds in terms of as capital gets withdrawn from fossil fuel-based assets, it builds up and becomes available for investment in renewables, but there are not enough renewables projects in the world at the moment, and so the cost of capital is dropping quite dramatically. And that is a big opportunity, and it has implications not just in terms of the cost of international capital, but also the cost of local capital. And as some of you know, there's kind of spare capital within the South African financial, quite a large amount of spare capital that would love to go into longer term investments in infrastructure, but things like the infrastructure fund that the DBSA has set up has taken much longer. And so there's still a buildup of spare cash. And a lot of this cash is focusing on is beginning to focus on renewables. I don't agree with Bruce that the drop in investment is because there's a reduced amount investment. Those drops in investment levels is because of massive drops in prices. So as the prices have dropped, the total amount of gigawatts coming online hasn't dropped. So and that's because prices have dropped about 90%, 80, 90% over the last decade, and the price of batteries has dropped also about 80% over the last 5 years. But just on batteries, by the way, that's lithium based. And if you want lithium batteries in South Africa now, you're going to wait quite a long time. But the big play in South Africa would be vanadium redox batteries. So we've got vanadium in South Africa. There's a vanadium mine just opened in Brits. And you can make, the Chinese have invested heavily in vanadium redox batteries as an alternative to lithium. And I think it's something we really need to look at. That doesn't deteriorate over 20 years. You don't have to buy it. The companies will lease it to you, etc. So that comes to, what's the politics of the renewable energy transition? And I think here I'm kind of maybe ending up in a kind of merger of what Janet is talking about and what Bruce is talking about. And I'm very influenced by the book Carbon Democracy by Mitchell, who essentially argued, and I don't have time to go into the details, that coal was the basis of social democracy, because coal, you need coal mines and you need railways, and then you have coal miner unions, and you have railway worker unions, and they form industrial unions. They become the basis of the union federations. Those are the basis of the social democratic electoral victories of the Second World War. And then you have a couple of decades of Keynesian economics. Maggie Thatcher comes in, smashes the unions, closes the coal mines, shifts to North Sea oil, and oil goes on a massive rise all over the world. And so argument is oil is the basis of neoliberalism. So if coal is the basis of social democracy and oil is the basis of neoliberalism, what is renewables the basis of? What's the politics of renewables? And in all, and what I've just said is a materialist analysis. The material reality of the infrastructures that are built has political effects. And so renewables are decentralized and distributed, as we all know, in lots and lots of small pockets of infrastructure scattered across spaces that previously were completely irrelevant to the energy space economy. So the question then becomes, what's the politics? And I think we need to pay a bit more attention to this. So I also don't agree with the argument that community-based energy is a loser. The front-runner countries in the renewables energy transition were Denmark and Germany. By the year 2000, 80% of all windmills in Denmark were owned by cooperatives. By 2012, 50% of all renewables in Germany was owned by cooperatives. In both those countries, neoliberal governments introduced the auction mechanism, which favored the corporates. It was designed by the corporates. In fact, there was a kind of international think tank, which included Anton Eberhard from UCT, plus a Brazilian and a Spanish guy and a couple of others, a Danish, who put together the idea of the auction mechanism as a way of favoring the corporates and using competitive markets to drive down prices. And that's actually what screwed the community energy in Europe. It was a corporate strategy enabled by neoliberal states, basically to smash community power. So there's nothing inherently wrong with these community structures. They actually were the incubators of the technologies that German corporates then stole effectively, because they played open source games. The corporates patented those, sold the licenses to Chinese companies who are making the infrastructures that the rest of us now buy. So there's a bit of an irony, a bunch of hippies in Germany build the technologies that German corporates sell to Chinese state-owned companies who then sell it to us because we are champions of the renewable energy transition. So we need to go back to the politics of this. The auction mechanism was introduced into South Africa at the beginning of our renewable energy transition. And so the only model we've got is the corporate model, because that's what the auction mechanism favored. we didn't start off like in Denmark and Germany with a community-based model that gets wound down, which we could have struggled to defend and prevented from being destroyed. Now we have to almost reverse engineer and say, what is it possible to retain an auction mechanism, but to make it progressive? And there's quite a few activist groups around the world who are looking at that, because the auction mechanism has become hegemonic. But can you politically shift the terms? Because all that an auction mechanism is a set of rules, and it just favors the corporates. But you can have an auction mechanism that favors, for example, in very favorable ways, municipalities, cooperatives, partnerships, and indeed Eskom. So Eskom is excluded from the integrated resources plan. It's not allowed to do renewables on scale. But as President Ramaphosa said when he announced 100 megawatt, and nobody really quoted it again, was there's nothing stopping Eskom doing renewables. He actually said it, but he's wrong. So Eskom needs to be liberated to be able to move into the renewable space, together with all of these other entities, municipalities, which is now possible under the 100 megawatt dispensation, co-ops, partnerships, et cetera. And rules do matter. Just to give you one example, in the emergency round, there's a rule that the batteries are not allowed to be charged on the grid at all. Now, what that means, if you take a company like Skytech, their tariff is R1.80 something. I think it's R1.80. Yeah. If they could charge their batteries, they would need half the number of batteries. If they had half the number of batteries, their tariff would be 91 cents. So just because there's literally a two-line rule in the RFP, which is not allowed to charge your batteries, all the emergency round renewable companies are actually selling the most expensive renewable energy in the world. It's just because of one rule. So that's just the power of rules. So I think we need to pay attention to the politics of these rules, which really then brings me to my last point, which is unbundling and divisionalization. In my view, Eskom transformed means that Eskom is going to have to get broken up. But I completely oppose unbundling and privatization. And if you think divisionalization is just merely a fig leaf for masking a commitment to unbundling, yes, then oppose divisionalization. But you can seriously divisionalize a vertically integrated utility so that you have a grid operator that can manage the grid as a commons, because that's basically what it is. And that grid can then, that system operator can then have a set of, can control the auction mechanism or the procurement mechanism, call it what you want, with a set of rules that empowers Eskom to be a generator, a green Eskom, but also all a multiplicity of other entities. And I think that makes sense, especially if you want to manage the grid to take up renewables. The large majority of power is generated in the northeast because that's where the coal is, and a future renewable energy-based grid is going to be primarily based on generators in the southwest. And the whole grid has to get flipped over 180 degrees, and that's going to cost at least 150 billion rand to do that. In the Northern Cape, there's basically no capacity for any more renewables. The maximum you can put on the grid in the Northern Cape now is maybe 100 megawatts. So I would say that divisionalization is an important lever for breaking up Eskom, and you have to break up Eskom if you want to energize to kind of rebuild a public ethos and an organization that is efficient and effective. Generation is obviously going to have to shrink, but it could rebuild itself off green, if it is allowed to move into green energy, which it needs to be allowed to do. So, yeah, I think I'm going to stop there. I'm just short of 15 minutes, but maybe just end off by saying to Janet, yes, green hydrogen has a big role to play. And all the people who are champion green hydrogen don't realize that what green hydrogen means is that you need a renewables-based grid. And it always astounds me of who's actually supporting green hydrogen without really realizing what they are supporting. But just, we talk about the mineral energy complex. We should talk about the mineral energy water complex because of the amount of water that the power stations require, and that water can be redeployed and used to make the hydrogen, or some of it at least. So yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mark. That was excellent. So it's now open for comments and engagements, and we've been getting some comments in the chat line or questions. If I just run through it, please note them so you can reply. Sasol has indicated they plan to lead on the green hydrogen opportunity. I don't know, maybe some response on that. Roland Nigam asks, what would you say are the key determinants for success in the IPPs that you have looked at? That's to Janet, to Bruce. What can Eskom do under the current difficult scenario to supply electricity to the 3 million South Africans who are not connected to the grid? Mondli Indovela asks, the climate change mitigation efforts are very interesting subject, especially for African countries. What does Mark Swilling say to a person that says, according to UNFCCC, Africa contributes less than 6% of global emissions? Why is the energy transition essential to a continent that produces the least carbon emissions? And then he asks further, secondly, what are best renewable energy sources for South Africa? Okay, so I'll give you all a chance to respond to some of these issues. Maybe Mark, you should go first, and then we'll go.
Yeah, just on the African story, I mean, I don't think anybody on the African continent is, let me put it this way. I think that the reason Africans need to energize using renewables is got to do with the fact that it's the cheapest option and the cheapest capital is available for investment in that option. So I don't think it's something you necessarily do because you are a major emitter of carbon. If Africa energizes using fossil fuels, none of the targets agreed in Paris will ever be achieved. And so the world has an interest in ensuring that Africa leapfrogs over the fossil fuel infrastructure age. And that's good for Africa in the sense that there's a whole multiplicity of resource flows and infrastructures that become available, and I don't have time to go into the detail, that actually reinforce diversification of economies rather than reinforcing dependence on fossil fuels. So that's, I think when it comes to Africa and renewables, it's less about climate, it's more about the cost of the kind of infrastructure one needs for development.
Thanks, Mark. Janet, do you want to come in? Janet, are you there? Have we lost Janet?
I don't see her.
Okay, come in, Bruce, go ahead.
Well, I think she's just come back.
I'm here, but I don't know what's going on. Anyway, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to respond to the question about what are the key factors which will make this model successful. And I think there are two things, and neither of them we are certain of at the moment. The first is the price, and whether the municipality can buy the electricity from our kind of community-owned renewable energy project at a price which is viable for them, and which gives a benefit in terms of a cash income to the cooperative. So this is what we haven't managed to test yet. I mean, we're still trying to, I mean, we think that there is a model there, and if you want the details, I think Patrick can provide them. But because we haven't actually done it yet, because we haven't actually received payment from the municipality, we know the municipality is worried because they say so many consumers aren't paying their electricity bills, and they they see electricity as a big income generator for them. And when they're in financial trouble, they see this as a bit of a threat. But we have to actually do it in practice to see if it is viable. And the other side of that is, of course, we'll get buy-in from the residents of Kwazakele and from other townships if they're getting hard cash. I mean, it's no good if it's just a charity or an installation put up by the university or something. I mean, they will look after that installation and maintain it and protect it from theft and so on, if they are benefiting. So they have to get a real economic benefit from it. And that's really, I think, what will make it successful. Thanks. That's all I've got at the moment.
Thanks. Bruce?
To Roland's question, which was about supplying those who are unconnected, I mean, I would say people, for the most part, those who are unconnected, that's been a failure of Eskom and the state to connect those people. And it's almost certainly in most cases because these are working class and poor people who are not prioritized. However, when there are, I think, communities where maybe it's very difficult to get infrastructure to them, this is where I can see a role for community run energy. And I don't know much about them, but microgrids. But I just to come back to the question of community energy, and also incorporating what Mark was saying. I think it never feels good to critique community energy because the people in favor of this are, natural allies to a progressive vision for energy. A lot of these communities are destitute, and the appeal for this is great. But I think we still need to take a step back, and if we say like a community is going to earn an income, well, where's that income coming from? It's coming from the sale of electricity. And the point I was trying to make is that if we want energy as a public good, a community making an income from selling electricity, which is being bought by people who don't have access to the infrastructure to produce energy. And in the case of renewable energy, it's not going to make sense to build renewable energy in every part of the country. There's certain areas that are best placed in terms of their potential. And my argument would be that the benefits, whatever benefits or surpluses that are generated from the sale of electricity, that those benefits be shared by the country as a whole, by society as a whole, and not benefit an area based on its location. We can also look at, the impacts of distributed PV in Australia and California. One thing that's happening there is that a lot of wealthier residents are able to install these PV panels, and what that means is they procure less electricity from the grid, and the people who have to make up the costs for the grid infrastructure are those who can't afford or get access to that energy as well. And that's not quite the same as a community-owned energy project, but there are implications to that we have to consider when it comes to. So yeah, I'll end it there.
Thanks, Bruce. Any other comments from Alex? Thanks for the rich discussion. I'm wondering what the panelists think of the DMRE and its role here. I ask in part because the Climate Justice Coalition has a campaign for a green new Eskom and see the DMRE as the biggest obstacle needing change. And so are mobilizing to challenge them in September. So that's one question. And then Richard Worthington asks, Mark, do you see synergies between the divisionalization of Eskom and democratization of distribution, getting private sector intermediaries out of household supply? So far, those are the two questions. Who would like to go? Mark? Who would like to go? Mark, would you like to go? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just think we maybe need to just step back and say, what do we mean by just transition? And there are three meanings in the South African narrative. The one is minimize damage, deal with the people who are going to lose their jobs and communities become devastated. So that's the one, which is really what Eskom focuses on. The second is the positive gains narrative, which is construction plus upstream industrialization is going to create, could create up to 1 million jobs over the next 20, 25 years. And basically that's based on this, if you look back at how many jobs we created to build 5 gigs up until now, it's roughly 50,000. So if you do 5 gigs, if you do 5 gigs per annum, it's 50,000 construction and operational jobs, plus upstream industrialization. So you could actually reindustrialize the South African economy on that basis. And that's another conception of the just transition, which is obviously very appealing. And then the third is the transformative agenda that is made possible by a new politics of decentralized and distributed energy. So for me, if you're interested in the third, but I'm interested in the second and the third, without negating the first one, divisionalization, in my view, to create to separate the grid from generation and to create an institution that is focused on looking after the grid so that it becomes a commons that enables the massive ramping up of renewables. I mean, 5 gigs per year is taken as 5 gigs for over 10 years up until now. So, it's massive. It's a massive, massive, almost wartime reconstruction and industrialization program, but it can't happen if the grid is not managed properly. And the grid is the Cinderella of the national energy infrastructure. It's just a forgotten aspect. So divisionalization, in my view, is absolutely critical because you create the transmission entity that then can set the rules. If you can then move the IPP office into that, which is what should happen, you can then create a set of rules that are potentially progressive in the empowerment of households and empowerment of mini grids and the empowerment of municipalities, cooperatives, etc. And if you do it in an integrated national way, in my view, it completely eliminates the problems that Bruce is referring to, which is cherry picking, creating these enclaves, these decarbonized enclaves for the rich or the privileged or the exclusive. So why I think we can't just focus on a transformed Eskom and the state to deliver renewables is that, and that's exactly what Janet is all about, and she's always been about that, which is organizing community power. We can't, because of a technocratic logic, eliminate the need to organize communities around their own energy power. We need organized communities. We need to rebuild social capital. We need to rebuild social cohesion. Look at what's happening all around us. And the best way to do that is on the most important stuff of everyday life, which is water and energy. So that's why I really like what Janet is doing as an example. I've been involved with something similar at the Lyndok Eco Village, where we have a similar mini grid. So yeah, that's my kind of rave on this interconnectedness between restructuring, divisionalization, and just decentralized and distributed energy infrastructures.
Any thoughts on DMRE at all before I move to Bruce?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Alex and I have had this discussion. I mean, it's obviously DMRE is the obstacle. I mean, at national level, there's a kind of aligning of planets with respect to the presidency, DEF, public enterprises, the Presidential Climate Commission, and Eskom. I think they're all aligning in a coherent way that could actually result in the kinds of decisions that unleash the energy transition. But DMRE is captured, by gas and nuclear type interests, and it is a massive It is a massive, massive obstacle. Whether this new alignment facilitated by the President's Commission is going to be able to deal with that challenge, I don't know. I mean, if you read the report that's come out of the Presidential Climate Commission in the last week or two, it says all the right things. But it's definitely not what DMRE is saying.
Bruce?
On the DMRE, I can only say that to Alex that what him and the Climate Justice Coalition are doing is the best response to that. And I think those who don't know about the Climate Justice Coalition and their planned mobilization against the DMRE should find out about it and support them. If it's okay, Vish, I'd like to, is it possible to continue on the community energy discussion?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I still think the fundamental point I'm trying to make is being missed. And yes, there is a caution about the wealthy in our society being able to capitalize on the concept of community-owned energy. But even if you were to circumvent that by putting in kind of hard and fast rules, again, the question of communities getting investment is still out there. But even if you have a community owning an energy, I don't see it as progressive for that community to be making an income on selling that energy. This is the point I'm trying to make. For that community to be involved in the production, to have a say and have input around prices, yes, but I think community ownership of a commodity, well, we want to decommodify it, but something which the whole society needs, and where it's produced, the best places to produce it are not kind of uniformly placed across the country. I don't see community energy as, or community owned energy as a, as some sort of progressive game changer. I would love to know a bit more about the auction rules, which could favor Eskom, and if they do favor Eskom, then why would the private sector stick around? So I guess that's a question to Mark. I mean, I can't agree more that the grid is we desperately need to upgrade and invest in the grid, and that it needs to be a priority. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is why it needs to be separated out from Eskom generation, and why, if we hold that Eskom generation should be the major force in deploying utility scale renewable energy, it doesn't seem to make sense to separate them out. And in its current phase, it seems almost certainly there to separate them out to create conditions for that suit private investment. So yeah.
Janet, do you want to add something?
Yeah, just briefly. So two things strike me. The one is just in response to Bruce. So the question here is that if we do this at municipal level, municipalities are going to buy that electricity from somewhere. So if not from Eskom, then from a private supplier. So the idea is that the community-owned renewable energy company or cooperative or whatever is selling it to the municipality at the same rate that the municipality would be buying it from wherever else, from a centralized provider or from a private company and so on. So it doesn't disadvantage the consumers. I mean, the residents of the township are still going to get those who are getting, almost everybody in KwaZulu gets free basic electricity up to the certain amount, and then they pay for whatever extra they need. They're not going to pay more for the electricity because it's owned and produced by residents of their community. Neither are they going to get additional free electricity, i.e. it doesn't disadvantage them or advantage them to be the consumers who are living next door to the people who are producing the electricity. On the other issue about capital investment, so I think the argument is that, you know, if the state is investing a huge amount in fossil fuels, in oil or gas pipelines, offshore oil, car power ship contracts, nuclear, although I'm leaving aside nuclear for the moment, but that those kind of huge investments could rather be done to support municipalities to implement this decentralized PV solar. Then the other question, of course, comes in terms of what the value chain is for local industrialization, and whether we can produce the PV panels in South Africa, whether we can produce all the components, etc. And I think Mark started answering some of that in terms of the issue of vanadium batteries and so on. But it applies also to the green hydrogen, whether we do have some kind of comparative advantage, whether there are certain components which we can produce in South Africa, which will play a role in influencing which form of renewable energy we go in. And really, I mean, the role of the state is, so it's not, look, it is an issue because, as you say, I mean, poor communities don't have capital to set up these things. So it would have to come through the state and through some kind of private-public partnership. But if the state is investing this massive amount of money in big infrastructure, they just must make wiser decisions about what exactly they are investing in.
Okay, thanks, Janet. There's another round of questions and themes that have come through. The first is Avina. She's posted a statement from Groundwork, and I could bring her in to say more about this. And then we have Lisa van der Merwe saying, it's my understanding that Eskom is interested in the transformative just energy agenda. Third jet option mentioned by not only first. Okay, I don't know if you can respond to that. And there's this whole conceptual distinction being made in the chat around decentralized distributed energy as not being the same thing as unbundling. And there's a sort of consensus on that conceptual separation. And then there's Richard talking about its key point is we can't energy democracy without social capital engagement, developing capacity for participation within the national electricity system. We need change from bottom as well as top down. Okay. Roland asks questions. To Mark, Eskom is probably set to hold on to the grid under the new dispensation. What are the key priorities the trade unions should be pushing for here? To Bruce, as Eskom unbundles, what do you see as the opportunities for better investments so that it keeps playing the important social role that it is mandated to fulfill? To Janet, are you already seeing significant improvements in livelihoods with new IPPs in KwaZulu and elsewhere, and with the grid reforms? Do these IPPs already have the capacity to work with municipalities? There's also a consensus point here about, I don't see how separating Eskom generation from transmission and system operator would put private sector profiteers in a better position. And then Sunny speaks about, the benefits of community-based renewables, and particularly what are the outcomes regarding that. It's not just about income. No, that's important. I think, Patrick, you had your hand up. Do you want to say something, Patrick? Jane, can we enable Patrick? He had his hand up. And then Avina, before we go into another round of responses. Patrick, are you there? Patrick Brennan, go ahead.
You know?
Go ahead.
So, just on the community and renewable energy, I'm not sure whether I can share a slide with you, but I can actually just read the numbers, might be quicker. The latest IRP says we must have installed capacity of 77 gigawatts by 2030. Our current installed capacity is around about 52 gigawatts. 25 households, if each of them had a 5 kilowatt share in a production system, can produce around about 285,000 rands worth a year of electricity at current prices in the Nelson Mandela Metropole. Taking that to township level, a 100 megawatt system would produce 285 million rands worth of electricity that can be fed into the grid. In other words, if each household in Kwazakele had a 5 kilowatt share in an installation, there would be 285 million rand that would come into the township. Yeah, we can talk about maybe it's a little bit less than that because some of that goes to the city. But if we did this at the scale of the entire country, if all 16 million households became involved, we would have installed capacity of 64 gigawatts. Now, obviously, you're not going to do every single household, but the principle should be that every household should be able to participate in whatever way in a local community-owned renewable energy installation up to the point of 5 kilowatts as a starting point. So I can share these slides with people, and you can take a look through the numbers, but I just wanted to give you guys an idea of the scale. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, please share that. That would be great. Avina, do you want to say something about your statement? Is she here still? Avina? From Groundwork? Go ahead. Avina, are you there? Jane, you've enabled her, right?
Yeah, I have.
Avina. Okay, so maybe she's not there at the moment. Okay, that's fine. Let's then pull in some responses. Janet, we can start with you, and then we can move to Bruce and Mark.
Okay, so just to Mark's question, are we already seeing livelihood improvements? No, the answer is no, because people are not getting income yet from the electricity that they're producing. They have got a little bit of livelihood improvement from a vegetable garden, which is another aspect of that project, but it's not to deal with this issue. In terms of the grid reforms, do the IPPs already have the capacity to work with municipalities? Well, yes and no. I mean, they have the capacity because they are organized into a cooperative and they can legally sign an agreement and they know what it's about and they know how much electricity they're producing. And capacity in terms of managing a bigger business, not quite yet, but the idea is that each of those neighborhood cooperatives would then form a secondary cooperative, which would have a bigger coordinating role and have greater capacity in terms of financial management and so on. I don't think they have that really at the moment, but yeah, they have the basic capacity to manage the installation as it exists. The problem is the municipality having the institutional regulatory mechanism in place. So that's really the problem. Of course, we also have problems with banking and community. There's no effective community banking, and we're looking at possible blockchain-based systems for payment options and that kind of thing. But all those things are taking a very long time to become accessible to people. I mean, just for a township neighborhood cooperative to open a bank account is a big problem because you have to have a regular income to sustain a business account and all those kind of things. Yeah, so it's yes and no.
Okay, thanks, Janet. Bruce?
So Roland asks, as Eskom unbundles, what do you see as the opportunities for better investment so that it keeps playing the important social role that it is managed to fulfill? Well, I think you mean divisionalizes, not unbundles, Roland. But to be clear, I don't support unbundling. But one argument I've heard is that unbundling will allow Eskom to deal with its debt better. And if that is the case, and regardless of whether it unbundles, but if Eskom can get rid of its debt and get access to concessionary finance, the kind of unprecedented levels, the wartime investment that Mark's talking about, then Eskom can play its role in leading the just transition and deploying the clean energy that we need. I don't think there's another question. Oh, well, I mean, Richard said, can't see how separating Eskom generation from transmission and system operator would put private sector profiteers in a better position. Well, I mean, you saw in the slides earlier that this is what Andre de Ruyter says is necessary to bring in the private investment, is to have an independent system operator. And what I suspect is what we're going to see is, as we have increasing renewable energy, there's going to be a lot more balancing that is required because it's variable energy. It's going to fluctuate throughout the day, and that has implications for what energy the system operator is procuring from coal plants and other kind of dispatchable resources. And what the private sector is going to want to know is that their energy is guaranteed to be bought. And what it doesn't want is a system operator that chooses Eskom or favors Eskom in those scenarios.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Bruce, there's very little evidence to support your argument. The bottom line is that I think if a progressive position continues to insist on the vertical integration of Eskom, it is reinforcing the most reactionary forces in our society. Basically, all the state capture forces want to keep Eskom exactly as it is. Secondly, large-scale capital is going to prefer to do a deal with the sovereign around a bailout, which is not going to result in any form of transformation. In fact, it will lead to another form of capitalist capture of Eskom. So the only way out is to reconfigure all the forces around a progressive restructuring of Eskom. And if I agree, unbundling is a problem because it means privatization, but it doesn't. But divisionalization does not mean unbundling. And divisionalization is a strategic option that puts in place an independent a publicly owned transmission entity that is responsible for the grid as a commons. And that's an extremely progressive position. It will, you're involved in, every one of us runs organizations in one form or another. You don't tell everybody to do everything. You have departments, you have divisions, you have units, you have all sorts of subgroups so that you can focus those people on their specific functions, and they must do their jobs the best within your organization. You can't tell in any big or small organization, everybody do everything. And that's the problem in Eskom. It is so entangled, you can't actually achieve anything. So if you want to take out a generation, which is where the most problematic state capture interests are located, you have to close, you have to shrink that kind of coal-based generation as you close down the fossil fuel power stations. But you have to then rebuild new renewable energy generators, but you don't necessarily want the same people to be doing it. So you have to have the flexibility to make sure you have the right people building the renewable energy power plants. But they can't be the people who then dictate to the transmission entity what the rules must be. The transmission entity must have in place a set of rules that the publicly owned Eskom generators will have to abide by, as will the private entities. And if those rules are appropriately structured so that they are uniformly applicable to everybody, public entities that do a good job, which is what does happen in many parts of the world, will do far better than the private sector. And if you have a set of rules that are specifically designed for local governments, then you're going to have an extraordinary opportunity on scale of the kind that Janet is talking about, where you can say local governments can build their own renewables generators in partnership with communities, or vice versa. Communities can build their own infrastructures, and the local authority has to be the buyer and the facilitator of the redistribution. So, and that is going to create, to answer the final question on the role of the trade unions, you're right, whoever asked that question. What's going to be left, what Eskom's going to be left with is a transmission entity. If we continue to back zero unbundling, zero divisionalization, the outcome is going to be a slimmed down Eskom with a transmission entity that's going to be captured by capital. If we are smart and strategic and we rebuild a set of alliances, then the unions can lead the way in specifying and shaping a set of rules that are pro-community, pro-social ownership, pro-municipal government, pro-public green energy. If we don't do this, if we continue to hang on to empirically completely unsubstantiated claims that an integrated Eskom is the progressive alternative, we are playing into very dangerous, very reactionary forces. And I'm up against those people on a daily basis. They are very dangerous, and I don't think it makes any sense whatsoever.
All right. Thank you for that. I'm going to wrap this up. I'm just going to just bring in some of the final points that were made. Alex, he says, for those interested in the mobilization around the DMRE, we put a basic form together for those who want to get involved. So please, people, tap the link and sign up. Sunny mentions, I have two communities, one in Soweto and one in Limpopo, looking at taking advantage of the 100 megawatt opportunities. The Limpopo community have already done some work on the capital side. The Soweto community haven't moved that far. The IPs in the REAP must by law have community involvement. The municipality will also have skills deficit because there isn't a renewable skill sector there yet. Okay, so there's real capacity issues also in local government. Victor talks about the transformation of society broadly is critical in the just transition and not only focusing on Eskom, although Eskom is important. And then there are links made to Janet's food work. And then Victor makes the point, health and engagement with local government is critical as part of the just to ensure the services are delivered meaningfully. We need to focus on local government, for this is where the impact of an unjust society is going to be the most felt in terms of political delivery. And also a big is critical, not just as a social net, but also make our economy work and not the elite and corporate economy as possible, as people will invest in township economies, I would suggest. Okay. And then Roland shares an example of a small solar system powering a school and small farms in Zimbabwe. So please look at that resource. Sorry, this is from Bobby Vish. I'm using Victor's link. Okay, thanks, Bobby. Sorry about that. Okay, this is great. So maybe we'll just take one last round of comments from the panel, and then I'm going to wrap up. Refers to community cooperatives, IPP in South America. They generate $88,000 annually from power. Yes, okay, we don't want to get Victor in trouble. Okay, I'm going to give the panel one final round to make quick comments, and then we're going to wrap this up. Maybe Mark, we'll go with you, and then we'll go to Janet, and then we'll go to Bruce. Okay, how's that?
Yeah,
Mark,
I just want
final comment?
to I just want to come back to my starting point where I basically outlined the extremely vulnerable financial position that Eskom is in. And subject to some form of restructuring and subject to a commitment to accelerated decarbonization, that is going to be able to unlock international and local capital on scale. But I suspect that the only way that that can be done is through a sovereign debt to climate swap. And I think it's worth progressives engaging in the 30 or so debt to climate swaps that have taken place in recent years around the world, which is essentially where creditors forgive debt, basically say to a sovereign, okay, you don't have to pay us back like happened in Poland, as long as the money that you don't pay us, you then use for certain purposes to restore nature or decarbonize. So let's say the creditors say to South Africa, we'll forgive $10 billion worth of debt as long as that goes into Eskom. And that is made conditional on a set of performance targets. What those targets are is what progressives need to engage on. Because obviously they're going to, the tendency will be to dilute them. And I don't think Eskom is committed to the third version of just transition. The third version of just transition is about post-capitalism. And the energy transition can be the vanguard for constructing post-capitalist prefigurative formations that change the basis of the whole economy.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. Janet? Final comment, unmute.
Sorry, I just wanted to respond. Yeah, I'm unmuted. I just wanted to respond to Roland's post about the solar system powering a school and a farm in Zimbabwe. So I think there's a role for those local self-sufficiency models. And I think especially in many parts of Southern Africa, you know, they can be appropriate. But in South Africa and dealing with our big urban context, I think really we have to look at another agenda, and the agenda is for a redistributive economy and for people to participate in the mainstream economy and benefit from it. So I see the transition as a dual transition. I mean, it's an energy transition which is absolutely essential for the planet, but it's also an economic transition to a different economy, which is inclusive. So whatever you call it, I mean, if you want to call it socialist, that's fine, but it doesn't matter what name you give it. It's absolutely imperative that, and we can see from the last few days how imperative that transition is. So it has to happen together with the energy transition. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Janet. Bruce, your final comment?
So I think maybe it was unfortunate that, and it's probably my fault, that much of the discussion centered around community ownership, when really I raised what I perceive to be limitations with it, because I believe a lot of people on the left are tempted to abandon Eskom, to believe Eskom should not be looked at because of the state it's in. And community energy is by no means the same as a private corporate energy company, and I apologize if I almost put the two in parallel. I mean, I would want to almost find some commonality between the perspectives, and Mark, I do take the RET looting faction of this country very seriously. Before I was at the AIDC, I was intimately involved in a campaign around PRASA, and I can tell you, if you think Eskom is bad, PRASA makes Eskom look like a model company. And so maybe what we can agree with is that new renewable energy is overwhelmingly private at the moment. And maybe we can then agree that there is a need to be vigilant about that, and that we need to urgently push on whatever fronts that Eskom roll out its own renewable energy. Mark, the way you described the visualization and the possibilities of it, it sounds great. I'm unconvinced, but maybe we can have a Zoom someday and you can run me through what that looks like. It seems quite clear to me from government policy documents going back years that this is about carving out more space for the private sector. But if we agree that we need socially owned renewable energy, I think that's a good start. Yeah, I hope we can agree that we need to focus on Eskom. A huge amount of our efforts go into Eskom, and ultimately that leads to the labor movement, where a lot of the reactionary forces Mark are talking about, unfortunately, are there as well, but they are by no means the majority. So yeah, thanks for the organizers as well.
Well, yeah, thank you for those comments, responses to questions, and engagement and debate. It was very, very enlightening. Just to emphasize a few themes that came out. I mean, the just transition starts off in reality, and it's not going to be a straight line because reality is complicated and complex, and our political economy that we've inherited historically is skewed and lopsided in a particular kind of way. Decarbonization, I think we all agree that transforming the energy system is a crucial starting point for decarbonization, and we've got some very important insights on the global political economy of this. I mean, some debates about where is renewable energy today in terms of cost, in terms of price. How is capital perceiving this opportunity? Is it risk to capital, or is there some other shift going on? South Africa, by the way, right now, capital is investing in renewables because of a failed state delivery of electricity. So there's something else going on in our specific context, which we also have to understand. There's a whole question of green hydrogen that was also placed into the discussion around decarbonization. There was the issue of vanadium batteries. So there's an unfolding sort of global political economy around decarbonization that we all need to kind of be au fait with and track and engage with. I think the second important theme was around tackling Eskom. And I think there were some very important specifics, contextual specifics given to the Eskom crisis. I mean, knowledge to most of us, but I think it was very helpful to revisit that. But there was also some very, very important kind of breakthroughs, I think, in the discussion. I think everyone in this conversation recognizes that Eskom has a role in terms of decarbonization, in terms of renewable energy, and so on. But there are hard strategic issues for us to clarify. There are hard strategic issues around its institutional makeup going forward. And here, I think the conceptual separation of divisionalization was unbundling was very useful, and I think there's learn about that. The idea of the commons being involved in all of that is very, very important. There's a whole issue of debt and how we manage the debt of Eskom. Some creative ideas there on debt swap, very important. But ultimately, there's room for struggle for labor to step in and to shape the future of Eskom and how it fits into this broader decarbonization challenge and process. So rulemaking, institutional transformation, labor has to step up in terms of playing a strategic role. I think the third theme that was very important was the issue of from below. I think we all agree that there's a lot of room and a lot of space for this decarbonization and deep just transition to happen from below. Referenced in were international experiences, Denmark and Germany. But ironically, actually, even during the kind of hegemony of carbon capital, in the United States, rural electrification cooperatives were also very, very important in that transition in the interwar years. But I think we need to really unpack the model, the cooperative model, a little bit more, okay? Because you could have a typical business model of a cooperative, and it doesn't really think about renewable energy as a commons, as a use value, as meeting member needs, and so on. So I think there's some more nuanced thinking that has to go into how we think about the alternative, maybe cooperative approach. Financing of stuff from below, I think, is something we need to explore much, much more. One example I can bring, or two examples I can bring into this, is in rural Italy, in the north of Italy. What we researched there was the old cooperative movement used its credit unions in every village to provide matching finance to state subsidies to household and members of the cooperative. And that is very, very interesting in accelerating the energy transition in rural villages in the North Italy. So building up capital pools through cooperative banks and credit unions, I think is something we really, really have to look at if we're going to accelerate things from below. We also do need to change institutions and policies that enable the streaming of capital and finance to processes that are happening from below. So there's a lot going on in the local space we have to think about. We have to think about the role of the local state and its regulatory regime. We have to think about what's happening right now in terms of people opting out of the grid and where that fits into a new renewable energy system. But in the end, I think the fourth theme that's come out here is that I think we all agree that the Eskom kind of behemoth and challenge is related to how we advance things from below as well at the same time. So it's not an either or in this conversation. And I think that's very, very important. I think nobody will take a firm dogmatic position that it's Eskom or nothing. We really have to think through some of the technical policy issues, the architecture of a new renewable energy system, and where would auctions fit in, where would the commons fit in, where would local municipal regulation fit in, etc. And ultimately, what is the role of Eskom? And I think if we approach this debate from that perspective, I think we'll be able to have a much more effective strategic politics from the side of climate justice forces in the country. So once again, thank you to everybody for sharing their time, sharing their knowledge, and sharing their insights. It was extremely enriching, and we will share the recording widely. Please take care in these difficult times. Stay safe.
Thank you, Vish.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.